My name's David Todman. For a living, I work with 3D computer animation, artificial reality. Because we happen to live in a beautiful three-dimensional world, our brains come ready evolved to process and understand the illusions people like me create. So reality and virtual reality fit neatly together.
But what do we really mean when we say the world is three-dimensional? What are we experiencing? And what's the difference between 3D out there in the real world and 3D in virtual worlds generated by computers? I'm Pia Jackson, and this is our three-dimensional film.
I was 10 years old, enduring a moment of crushing boredom while on holiday in Spain. My dad, a bona fide scientist, sat with me on a hotel bed and proceeded to explain something so disturbing, so mind-blowing, that we've given ear defenders to young Sam here, who represents my 10-year-old self. Hopefully, this will protect his developing brain from what Dad is about to discuss. The only thing to look at was a cheap print of a terrible painting, the kind you often find in three-star hotels. It was ethnic in a comforting but inauthentic way. As usual, my dad spoke without warning.
How do you know that picture is actually there? I mean, over there on that wall.
I don't know, because I can see it.
You can see it. You can see it? What does that mean? How can you see it over there when you're over here? It's an interesting thought. We feel like we're seeing actual objects in the distance, as if we're looking outwards when we see the world. But we can't be. Our eyes don't have fingers. They can't reach out and touch things. That picture isn't really there at all. It's just an image shining on the back of your eye. That's all you're looking at. The out there bit is just an illusion. A mind trick.
Bloody hell!
For weeks, I couldn't look at anything without questioning it. Was nothing really out there? Did anything exist at all?
You're not real. You're not real. You're not real either. You're not real. You're not real.
The feeling that we're looking outwards when we observe the world is a profound one. And for much of history, prevailing wisdom held that light, or something like light, emits from our eyes in order for the world around us to become visible. This is called the extramission theory of sight. It took until the 17th century for scientific experiment to disprove the extramission theory. But personal experience is a powerful thing.
In 2002, a study of American college students found that 50% of them still explain vision using this extramission theory. Even science students who'd been taught otherwise.
In spite of our perceptions, we now know that sight is possible because light enters our eyes from the outside and is focused upside down on a photoreceptive surface called the retina. This is the intromission theory of sight. But there's clearly more to vision than simply the recording of light. We impose patterns, connections and meaning onto our environment, a process unique to each of us. That's why we get the feeling of extramission, because most of what we understand about our world comes from within. And we can grasp this sense much better if we analyse one of the fundamentals on which vision is based, the process of projection. Understand this, and it becomes much easier to see why we experience the world so subjectively.
Image projection is the process of translating three-dimensional information onto a two-dimensional surface, preserving important relationships and proportions. Photographs are a form of projection, as are maps.
It turns out we're not capable of directly experiencing the three-dimensional world beyond our reach, as my dad so cruelly pointed out. We can only interpret its light, entering our eye and forming a two-dimensional image on our retina. So, vision relies fundamentally on a process of inward projection.
But this means that all the three-dimensional judgments we make about distance, scale, and speed are done so not from the world itself, but from a flat facsimile, a map.
And this severely limits the information available to us. So humans have had to evolve an array of mental tools that help put the 3D back into what's essentially two-dimensional eyesight. Here are just a few of them.
Over short distances, our eyes have to work very hard to make subtle focal adjustments between objects, a process called accommodation. As we grow up, we learn to associate the varying sensations of accommodation with specific distances, thus helping us make more accurate judgments. It's one of the primary senses we use when reaching out for things, which is why young children, who are still developing this ability, can be rather clumsy.
If two objects fall directly in our line of sight, we can tell which is further away because it will disappear when it passes the nearer object. This is called occlusion. In a situation like this, occlusion is vital because this rather abstract balloon floating in the air is very difficult for us to locate using any other cues or past experience. See?
The Earth's atmosphere is a mist of tiny particles spaced widely apart. Light plays a game of chance as it passes through, occasionally striking an air molecule, which deflects, bends, or absorbs it.
Over short distances, like the distance between you and me, collisions are unlikely, and so light reaches our eye almost uninterrupted.
But over large distances, the chance of collision increases, and these interactions add up to reduce light's overall intensity and depth of colour. The result is called colour perspective, and it helps us position landscape objects within our environment.
Colour perspective is a device loved by landscape artists, who use it to define scale in their work. This is a painting by Claude Monet. If you look closely, you can see that there's actually very little painted detail there, but the way he represents light shows us that this is the foreground, this is the background, and we're not looking at some small rocks here, we're looking out over a vast landscape, all courtesy of our brain's sense of colour perspective.
As objects move towards or away from us, they appear to change in size. If an object is shrinking, this tells us that it's moving away from us. If it's growing, we know that it's approaching. This is called kinetic depth perception.
When looking at near objects, our eyes are only able to focus on a very narrow band of distance. We call this a shallow depth of focus. However, when we look over long distances, our depth of focus is much greater.
We therefore judge the scale of what we're looking at using this effect. It's called defocus blur. The effect is most striking When we take a large-scale image like this and artificially shorten its depth of focus, this triggers the circuitry for defocus blur in our brain and confuses us into seeing everything as miniature in scale. In photography, this is called a tilt or tilt-shift effect, because it's created using a lens that can either tilt forwards or sideways within its enclosure. Hello, is that post-production graphics? Yeah. Yeah, I know, but it's actually miniature. No, that's not what I wanted. No. When we travel along, objects appear to pass us by. The world should become a rather confusing blur. However, there's a pattern to the movement of objects that actually provides us with some rather useful three-dimensional information. Near objects appear to pass quickly across our field of vision, while more distant objects travel progressively more slowly. This enables us to quickly build an accurate depth picture of our environment. The faster the movement, the nearer the object. This phenomenon is called motion parallax. Motion parallax is central to the way we build our internal three-dimensional world. In fact, even a landscape made entirely of flat images can seem convincingly three-dimensional, as long as it moves with convincing motion parallax. This is a trick exploited by computer graphics, when there isn't the time or need to make things more realistically. It's a technique known as 2.5D. 2.5D can be a quick and effective way to trigger our sense of motion parallax, and therefore simulate 3 dimensions. However, it has its limitations, as you can see. But the parallax effect is also responsible for one of our most amazing mental tricks, the one that gets us closest to simulating reality. Because we have two eyes, about 60 millimeters apart, we get two slightly different versions of the world fed to our brains. The effect would be the same if we took two photographs from a single eye that's travelling sideways. So, just as with motion parallax, near objects will shift more between the images than distant ones. The beauty of having two eyes is that they allow us to see this parallax without actually moving. And so we have constant access to information about an object's position and scale. This ability is called stereopsis, and it's stereopsis that 3D TVs and movies exploit to give us an immersive viewing experience. Here's how that works. 3D filmmakers capture two versions of a scene using lenses about 60 millimeters apart. This distance simply imitates your eye separation. The 3D TV or cinema then projects both images simultaneously. But a filter, often in special glasses, ensures that each of your eyes only sees one. This triggers the stereopsis process in your brain, and that does the rest, giving you the strange sense of being immersed in the action. The idea that eyesight begins as a flat projection may not seem that remarkable today, but we owe some of this certainty to one of the most brilliant minds of the Renaissance, a man who revealed the trick of projection by being one of the first to reproduce it on paper. And in so doing, he also uncovered a whole other set of rules that govern our internal sense of distance and proportion.
Filippo Brunelleschi was one of the finest minds in 15th century Florence. He was many things: an architect, engineer, mathematician and artist, the original Renaissance man, 50 years before Leonardo da Vinci.
In 1415, inspired by ideas coming from the Arab world, he formed a theory about light and optics, and in a moment of genius, devised an experiment to prove it.
Brunelleschi would one day become famous as the architect of the great cathedral dome in Florence. But in 1415, this was just an idea on paper. However, in front of the unfinished cathedral stood a beautiful octagonal baptistry that provided the perfect subject for a unique painting. Brunelleschi stood in the piazza, opposite the baptistry doors and positioned 2 easels side by side. On one was a mirror, on the other a canvas. Standing with his back to the building, he precisely translated important points and lines in the mirror image to their corresponding positions on the canvas. When he'd filled in the detail, he cut a small hole in the picture and looked back through towards the baptistry. Every time he placed the mirror in the way, it reflected his painting, and to each viewer's amazement, there seemed no difference between the actual scene and the painting's reflection. In a single image, Brunelleschi had captured the perspective of his environment.
More important than the effect of perspective was Brunelleschi's ability to see underlying rules which explained its power.
He could see that parallel lines appeared to converge on a single point, a vanishing point. This point always fell on a line exactly at eye level, the horizon line. He also noted that objects appear to shrink in a predictable way as they recede into the distance.
Of course, what perspective achieves is an approximation to what our own eye does, projecting a 3-dimensional world onto a 2-dimensional surface, so the similarity is not surprising. But it was 200 years before the intromission theory of sight was accepted, and so in his day, Brunelleschi's perspective appeared like strange magic.
In 1435, the rules of perspective were turned into an artist's handbook by Leon Battista Alberti. And this marked a pivotal moment in the history of art, because painting had become a 3-dimensional art form, like sculpture and architecture. And the technical discipline of linear perspective, which spread like a virus throughout Europe, also connected art with science in a new way. And this idea was hugely influential on the work of Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo Buonarroti, who came soon after. These strands of thought resonated for centuries, with artists ambitiously working to improve their use of realism and perspective. And scientific inventions, like the camera obscura and microscope, also played their part, particularly among the Dutch masters. But the next great revolution in this marriage between art and science took 400 years to arrive. It came with the invention of the stills camera, first demonstrated around 1820. Unpromising boxes like this were the first machines that could both see and capture the world as our own eye does. So the images they produced might have been faint and often blurry, but they amazed the world just as Brunelleschi's images had centuries earlier. But this revolution was different. Linear perspective elevated the status of artists because it demanded of them a much higher level of technical skill. And so Brunelleschi and Alberti made it harder to become an artist. But cameras were about to bring perspective to the masses.
Nearly 200 years after its invention, the camera is more popular than ever. A testament to its power as a tool for remembering the world just like our eyes. Most photographers are not skilled artists. They're simply recording their lives. And we've become blasé about our ability to do this, forgetting the sense of wonder that greeted the first photographers and the later amazement of early cinema goers.
But there's since been another revolution in this story, one that began quietly in the mid-20th century. It now amazes us not because of how accurately it represents the world, but because of its ability to create worlds, fantastical places that only ever exist as numbers on wafers of silicon. You're living through it. It's the computer graphics revolution. Yeah, hi, is that post-production graphics? Yeah, no, this time it's massive.
The term computer graphics describes any image created using a computer. Today it comes in many forms. 3D computer graphics recreate the perspective of the world around us, immersing us in virtual space.
As is often the case, much of the early work in this field was performed or funded by the military. In fact, the phrase computer graphics itself originated at the Boeing Corporation in 1960. Boeing also created the first virtual human, sometimes known as Boeing Man, as a way to test the ergonomics of their aircraft. However, the subject was really born much earlier in the Second World War, long before he even had a name, and one of the most iconic pieces of computer graphics dates from this time. You may never have thought of it like this, but the classic display of enemy aircraft on a radar screen is perhaps one of the first representations of the world generated entirely by machines.
In the 1940s and 50s, computers were hugely complex and expensive. Yet, in spite of this, artists were remarkably quick to see their potential as creative tools, often buying up ex-military hardware and converting it into a force for art. But in 1958, what had been an obscure art form burst onto the mainstream when computer graphics were used to produce the opening titles to Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo. Suddenly, computer graphics were all the rage.
3D computer graphics came to life in the 1960s and 70s as programmers made a giant leap in thinking. They began to see computers not just as tools for producing images of the world, but as simulators of the world itself, its physical laws and dimensions. And many of the systems devised for doing this still hold true today.
So, how do you make a world inside a computer? Well, that's a question almost as big as the world itself. And as this film isn't aimed at geniuses, let's keep the answer simple but interesting. A world is defined by the objects within it, because without objects there's just nothing. And objects are defined by the space they occupy. So, in essence, all you need to create a virtual world is a system for defining the location of things in space. And just such a system has existed for over 400 years. It's called the Cartesian coordinate system, named after its inventor, the brilliant mathematician René Descartes.
In the Cartesian system, 3 lines or axes stretch out at right angles to each other, 3-dimensional graph paper. Descartes used the letters X, Y, and Z to differentiate them, a convention that even modern computer software uses to this day. Every point in virtual space has a unique X, Y, and Z value, and the numbering starts from the center of an imagined universe. This point is called the origin. So an object placed on the origin would have Cartesian coordinates of 0, 0, 0. This ingenious system allows us to build up a world full of objects, with clearly defined shapes and locations.
A virtual world is just an invisible, theoretical place inside a computer until we take a picture of it. So, when computer programmers in the 1960s and 70s were looking at ways of visually representing virtual worlds, they turned to the idea of using a virtual camera, because cameras were a concept already familiar to their new audience.
The idea was simple. Create a type of virtual object called a camera. For ease of use, give it many of the functions found on real cameras, and allow it to be positioned anywhere in the world. When the software user wants to see a picture of their world, they press a virtual shutter and wait for the photograph to appear. Instead of film inside the camera, images would be displayed on a computer monitor, a newly invented 2-dimensional surface capable of displaying projected images. This interface design, first conceived 40 years ago, is now universal to all 3D computer software.
But wait a minute. In order to produce imagery, real or virtual, you also need one other vital ingredient: light. Computer programmers have also needed to invent a form of virtual light that shines on their virtual world and illuminates the objects within it. But this presents a major problem, because light is incredibly complex and difficult to simulate.
As computers have grown steadily in power, 3D software has been able to implement increasingly sophisticated approximations to light. It's also been able to represent increasing amounts of detail. This is why computer graphics today look a lot more realistic than they did, say, 40 years ago.
But the story of virtual light is an ongoing adventure because despite huge advances in technology, desktop computers are still not powerful enough to quickly simulate how light works in the real world. So, unlike photography, producing realistic images in virtual worlds is far from an instantaneous process. In fact, it's acquired its own name, rendering, but that's a subject for another film.
So rendering uses an imaginary camera to capture virtual light bouncing off virtual objects in an imagined three-dimensional world. Amazing, isn't it? And the beauty of virtual worlds is that they're not bounded by the rules of reality, so what's possible can be stretched far beyond the limitations of real life.
Perspective can be toyed with, or even removed. 360-degree lenses produce strange spherical images. Virtual cameras, about 60mm apart, combine to produce renders that trigger our sense of stereopsis. And objects can be instantly turned to glass, allowing us to see their inner structure. The rendering process also allows us to play with visual styles. Images can look like cartoons, technical drawings, or something uniquely computery.
So how we visualise virtual worlds has as much to do with the rendering process, the taking of the photograph, as it does the structure of the world itself. And that's a fundamental point, because it brings us back to our opening question. How does the real three-dimensional world out there differ from virtual worlds inside a computer? And the short answer to that is, it doesn't.
We only perceive depth and meaning in art because it stimulates the mental processes we've evolved to create meaning from our world. And our sense of distance, colour, and perspective are not really properties of three-dimensional space at all. They're properties within us. You think you can see two people looking out from a beautiful hill, but we're not really there. We're just 2 million pixels emitting light from a screen. We're a product of your rendering process.
So in a profound way, we all live in a virtual world, one of our own creation. And the other worlds of painting, photography, and 3D computer graphics are just part of the rendered image we call consciousness. Art simply imitates life.